CEO husband demands divorce. Because I'm infertile, but when I got pregnant, he fell to his knees in tears. Welcome, dear viewers. I'm so glad you're here today. I hope you're all doing well and feeling blessed. Let's start with a short and heartfelt prayer. Dear God, please bless everyone watching this video today. Fill their hearts with love, peace, and understanding. May they find strength in their relationships and trust in your divine plan. Amen. Now, I have a small request for you. After watching this story, please let me know how you would rate it out of 10 in the comments. If you want me to continue creating more stories like this, drop a red heart in the comments. But if you think I should stop, you can leave a black heart. Today's story is incredibly important for anyone who believes in love and second chances. It's not just a story, it's a message for loving couples and a lesson for society. So, don't miss a single second. Stay with me till the very end. I promise this story will melt your heart and leave you feeling inspired. Now, hit that subscribe button and let's dive into this special story together. Chris Wakes was the kind of man who turned heads wherever he went. Tall, with a chiseled jawline, piercing blue eyes that could cut through glass, and a neatly trimmed beard that framed his face perfectly. He carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. His thick, dark hair was always immaculately styled, not a strand out of place, reflecting his disciplined and meticulous personality. Chris had built his business empire from the ground up, rising from a modest background to become one of the most powerful and influential millionaires in the city. His sharp business acumen and strategic mind made him a force to be reckoned with in the corporate world, and his success afforded him a life of unparalleled luxury. His mansion was a sprawling masterpiece, set on a private estate with marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering cityscape, and a staff of highly trained professionals catering to his every need. Expensive art pieces lined the walls, chandeliers imported from Italy hung from the high ceilings, and the lush gardens outside were maintained with military precision. Yet, despite the grandeur surrounding him, Chris's greatest treasure was not his wealth or his business empire. It was Alicia. From the moment he first laid eyes on her, he knew she was different. Alicia was breathtakingly beautiful, with smooth brown skin that glowed under the softest light, wide and captivating eyes framed by long dark lashes, and perfectly arched brows that gave her an air of natural elegance. Her braided hair cascaded down her back, each strand woven with care, and styled with a sophistication that turned heads. But it wasn't just her beauty that had captured Chris's heart. It was her warmth, her kindness, and the effortless grace with which she carried herself. She had a quiet strength beneath her soft exterior, a resilience that Chris admired deeply. Their love story had been nothing short of magical. Chris had pursued Alicia relentlessly, showering her with grand gestures and heartfelt confessions until she finally gave in to the intensity of his love. Their wedding had been a lavish affair, with the most influential figures in society in attendance. Alicia had walked down the aisle in a custom-made gown of ivory silk, her radiant smile lighting up the room as Chris stood at the altar, barely able to breathe at the sight of her. Their honeymoon had been equally enchanting, a private villa in the Maldives, where they spent days exploring crystal-clear waters and nights wrapped in each other's arms beneath the stars. For the first 2 years of their marriage, their life together was blissful. Chris would return from long days at work to find Alicia waiting for him, her arms wrapping around his neck as he kissed her forehead and held her close. He spoiled her endlessly, buying her designer clothes, expensive jewelry, and flying her to the most exotic destinations in the world. Alicia, however, wasn't swayed by the material things. What mattered to her most was Chris's presence, the quiet moments they shared curled up on the couch, talking about their dreams and their future. And that future always included children. Chris had always dreamed of having an heir, someone to carry on his legacy, to inherit the empire he had built with his own hands. He imagined teaching his son how to navigate the business world, taking him to board meetings, and preparing him to take over the company one day. Alicia shared that dream. She longed to be a mother, to feel the warmth of a baby in her arms, to raise a child who would grow up surrounded by love and security. But as months turned into years, that dream remained just that, a dream. The first year they brushed it off, thinking it would happen naturally in time. But when 2 years passed with no pregnancy, Alicia began to feel the weight of disappointment settle over her heart. Chris was supportive at first, reassuring her that it would happen when the time was right, that they just needed to be patient. But after the 3rd year, Chris's patience began to wear thin. He began insisting on medical tests, dragging Alicia to fertility specialists, hoping for answers. Alicia endured blood tests, ultrasounds, and invasive procedures, all while trying to keep her emotions together. The results were always the same. Nothing was medically wrong with her. There was no explanation for why they couldn't conceive. Chris's frustration began to bleed into their marriage. He became colder, more distant. The gentle kisses and soft whispers of love were replaced by short conversations and tense silences. He buried himself in work, spending longer hours at the office and less time at home. Alicia would wait up for him at night, sitting by the window, hoping to hear the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. But more often than not, he wouldn't come home until after she had fallen asleep. The few times they did make love, it felt strained, more like an obligation than an expression of love. Alicia began to feel inadequate, wondering if she was the reason Chris was growing distant. She would catch him staring at her sometimes, a complicated look in his eyes, part longing, part frustration. She knew he loved her, but the unspoken disappointment was starting to build a wall between them. Alicia would cry silently in the shower, pressing her hand to her flat stomach, praying for a miracle. She visited churches, lit candles, and whispered desperate prayers into the quiet night. "Please, God," she would beg, "please give us a child. Let me give Chris the family he dreams of." But each month, the empty pregnancy tests felt like a knife to her heart. The emptiness of the mansion, the silence of the unused nursery they had once decorated with hope, became a constant reminder of what they didn't have. Chris tried to hide his frustration, but Alicia could feel it. The tension in their marriage grew heavier with each passing day. Chris would avoid conversations about children, brushing them off with a sharp edge in his voice. Alicia felt like she was losing him, like the foundation of their marriage was beginning to crack under the weight of their unfulfilled dreams. And deep down, Chris was starting to wonder if his future could survive without an heir. Chris Wakes had always been a man who thrived under pressure. He built his empire on the foundation of grit and strategic brilliance, navigating the volatile world of business with an unwavering sense of control. But the pressure of his unfulfilled dream, the desire to become a father, was something he couldn't outsmart, couldn't negotiate his way through, and it was slowly unraveling the carefully constructed stability of his life. The weight of that emptiness settled heavily on his broad shoulders, growing heavier with each passing month, as the realization set in that despite his immense wealth and influence, this was one thing he couldn't buy or manipulate into existence. Chris had spared no expense in trying to find a solution. He had paid for the best medical treatments, flown Alicia to the most renowned fertility clinics in the country, and hired specialists whose names carried prestige and success rates that bordered on miraculous. But every attempt ended the same way, with empty test results and Alicia's silent tears hidden behind a brave smile. He watched as Alicia went through round after round of treatments, hormone injections that left her nauseous and exhausted, invasive procedures that left her pale and trembling, but the results never changed. Negative. Month after month, Chris would sit beside her on the marble floor of their lavish bathroom. holding her hand as she stared down at another single pink line on the pregnancy test. Alicia would swallow her disappointment and force a smile, brushing his cheek with her trembling fingers and whispering, "Next time, maybe." But Chris could see the sadness behind her wide, beautiful eyes, the growing shadow of inadequacy that she tried so hard to hide from him. Alicia had always been a pillar of strength in his life, a woman who carried herself with grace, even in the most difficult of circumstances. But Chris could see the cracks forming beneath that polished exterior. Her braided hair, once always styled to perfection, began to hang a little looser. Her smile, once radiant and effortless, now felt strained. And Chris hated himself for feeling frustrated. He knew it wasn't her fault. He knew Alicia was trying. God, she was trying so hard. But as the months slipped into years, the silence of their mansion became unbearable. He had built this empire for his future, envisioned raising a son who would one day inherit his legacy, teaching him the art of business, the importance of strength and resilience. He pictured a boy with his eyes and Alicia's smile running through the vast hallways of their mansion, the sound of his laughter filling the empty spaces that now echoed with quiet sadness. But that future remained out of reach, slipping through his fingers no matter how hard he tried to hold on. Chris's frustration began to manifest in subtle but corrosive ways. He became colder, his once patient and understanding nature beginning to fray at the edges. He threw himself deeper into work, using the chaos of board meetings and financial negotiations to numb the gnawing emptiness inside him. He would leave early in the morning before Alicia woke and come home late at night, the soft glow of the bedroom lamp illuminating her sleeping form as he slipped beneath the covers, too exhausted to reach for her the way he used to. Alicia noticed the shift, even though she never said it aloud. She felt the growing distance between them like a physical ache. Chris no longer touched her with the same tenderness. Their conversations became transactional, discussions about appointments and schedules rather than dreams and desires. The rare times they were intimate, it felt mechanical, as though Chris was trying to solve a problem rather than express love. Alicia would lay awake at night, her hand resting on her flat stomach, wondering what was wrong with her. She had been to every specialist, undergone every test, and yet her body continued to betray her. The pressure to give Chris the child he wanted, the heir he needed, felt like a suffocating weight pressing down on her chest. She began to blame herself, questioning if there was something broken inside of her that no doctor could fix. Chris's distance only compounded her guilt. He had always been so loving, so patient, but now there was a guarded edge to him, a quiet frustration simmering beneath the surface. He stopped looking at her the same way, his gaze no longer lingering with admiration, but rather with disappointment. Though he never said it aloud, Alicia could feel it. The walls of their mansion, once a symbol of their success and happiness, now felt cold and hollow. Alicia would wander through the expansive hallways alone, running her hand along the ornate carvings of the furniture, wondering if this house would ever echo with the sound of a child's laughter. The nursery remained untouched, the soft white crib sitting empty beneath a canopy of delicate stars. Alicia would sit in that room sometimes, pressing her palm to her stomach and whispering quiet prayers to a God who didn't seem to be listening. She tried to keep up appearances, attending charity events and galas on Chris's arm, smiling for the cameras as though their life was perfect. But behind the closed doors of their mansion, Alicia was breaking. Chris's frustration finally began to spill over. One night, after another failed attempt, Chris had come home late, his tie loosened and his expression hard. Alicia had been waiting for him, her eyes red from crying. "Chris," she whispered, reaching for him, but he pulled away, running a hand through his dark hair. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," he said, his voice low and strained. Alicia's heart stopped. "What are you saying?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Chris's jaw tightened. I don't know how much longer I can watch us fail. I need a family, Alicia. I need a child." His words cut through her like a blade. Alicia's hands trembled as she stepped toward him, her wide eyes brimming with tears. "I'm trying," she said brokenly. "I know," Chris replied, his voice softening, but the tension in his body remained. He reached out, brushing a hand against her cheek, but the touch felt hollow. I don't know if trying is enough anymore." Alicia watched as Chris turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the dim light of their bedroom. That night, Alicia lay awake, her hand resting over her heart, as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She had never felt more alone. Chris was slipping away from her, and no matter how much she loved him, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't give him the one thing he wanted most. And the terrifying thought that she might lose him because of it began to settle into her heart like a cold, immovable weight. Chris Wakes had never been a man who made decisions lightly. Every choice he had ever made, whether in business or life, had been calculated, strategic, and deliberate. He had built his empire on the back of hard decisions, mastering the art of negotiation and control. But the choice he was about to make that evening weighed heavier on him than any business deal or financial risk ever had. The mansion was unnervingly quiet as Chris stepped through the grand double doors, his polished shoes echoing against the cold marble floor. His heart hammered painfully in his chest, his jaw tightening as he rehearsed the words in his head over and over again, knowing they would cut Alicia to the core. His secretary had been the one to suggest it, though not directly. Over dinner at a business function weeks ago, she had leaned in close, her manicured hand resting lightly on his wrist as she said softly, "Chris, you deserve a family. You deserve an heir. Some things are just out of our control." Her implication had been subtle, but Chris knew exactly what she meant, and maybe she was right. Maybe he had been holding on to a fantasy for too long, thinking that love alone would somehow be enough to build the future he had always envisioned. The sound of Alicia's footsteps brought him back to the present. She walked into the room with her usual quiet grace, her smooth brown skin glowing beneath the soft light of the chandelier, her long braided hair falling elegantly over her shoulder. She smiled at him despite the exhaustion that clung to her beautiful eyes. Even now, after everything, she still looked at him like he was the center of her world, and that only made what he was about to do harder. Chris swallowed hard, his throat dry as he stood and gestured toward the velvet love seat near the fireplace. "Alicia," he said softly, his voice steady but strained. "Sit down. We need to talk." Alicia's smile faltered, her wide eyes narrowing slightly in concern as she moved toward him and sat down. Chris remained standing, his hands shoved into the pockets of his tailored slacks as he stared down at the floor, struggling to find the right words. "Chris," Alicia whispered, her brow furrowing. "What is it?" He lifted his gaze, his eyes dark with conflict, as he finally spoke. "Alicia, this isn't working." Her breath hitched, her hand drifting to her chest. "What isn't working?" Chris's chest tightened painfully. "Us." Alicia's heart began to race. "Chris, what are you saying?" He took a slow breath, his voice low and controlled even as his insides churned violently. "I need a child, Alicia, an heir. We've tried for years and it's not happening. I've done everything I can, paid for the best doctors, arranged the best treatments, but nothing. And I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending that love alone is enough." Alicia's lips parted in shock. Tears blurred her vision as her hands gripped the armrests of the love seat. "Chris, I'm trying. I've tried everything." "I know," Chris said quickly, his tone sharp. "And I don't blame you, Alicia. This isn't your fault, but it doesn't change the fact that I need an heir to secure my legacy, my business, my empire. It needs someone to carry it forward. And His voice broke slightly as he forced himself to finish the sentence. "And you haven't been able to give me that." Alicia's body began to tremble. "So, what are you saying? What are you going to do?" Chris's expression hardened as he forced himself to maintain composure. "I'm asking for a divorce." Alicia's heart stopped. The word struck her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. Her vision blurred as tears slipped down her cheeks, her chest tightening painfully. "A divorce?" she whispered brokenly. Chris's jaw flexed, his gaze dark and resolute. "Yes, I've made up my mind. I'm planning to marry someone else." Alicia's breath shuddered out of her, a strangled sound escaping her throat. "Who?" "My secretary." His voice was cold, mechanical. She understands what I need, and I believe she'll be able to give me a child." Alicia's hands covered her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. "Chris, you're leaving me for her?" Chris's eyes darkened. "This isn't about love anymore, Alicia. This is about my future." Alicia's heart shattered into pieces. The man she had loved with every part of her soul, the man she had stood beside through every triumph and failure, was walking away from her because her body had failed him. Her breathing grew shallow as the weight of his betrayal crushed her. "Chris," she whispered brokenly, "don't do this, please." Chris's expression tightened. He couldn't look at her as he said, "I'm sorry." Alicia's hands gripped the fabric of her dress as her shoulders shook with silent sobs. You promised me forever." "Forever changes," Chris said quietly. His words felt like knives in her chest. Alicia stood slowly, her knees trembling beneath her. "If this is what you want, I won't fight you," she whispered. Chris's eyes darkened. "Alicia, no." Her voice trembled as she stepped back. "You've made up your mind. There's nothing more to say." Chris's heart hammered painfully in his chest as he watched her retreat toward the door, her back straight even as tears streamed down her cheeks. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to remain still, to remain cold. He couldn't afford to waver now. Alicia turned at the doorway, her wide eyes shimmering with tears as she whispered, "I hope she gives you what you want, Chris. I really do." Then she walked away, leaving Chris standing alone in the room, his chest aching with a hollowness he couldn't explain. As the sound of Alicia's footsteps faded down the hall, Chris closed his eyes and pressed his hand to his forehead. He told himself he was doing the right thing, that this was the only way to secure his future. But as the silence of the mansion settled around him, a dark sense of regret began to creep beneath his skin, tightening his chest with an unfamiliar sense of loss. And for the first time in his life, Chris Wakes wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Alicia lay awake in the darkened bedroom, the pale moonlight casting faint shadows across the polished wooden floor of the mansion. Her body felt strangely light yet filled with a curious warmth, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. Her breath hitched as she shifted beneath the soft covers, pressing a hand to her abdomen as an odd flutter stirred beneath her palm. Her heart began to pound, her mind racing with thoughts she didn't dare entertain. But the feeling persisted, a strange yet undeniable pull deep within her body, almost as if something had shifted, as if something had changed. Swallowing hard, Alicia sat up slowly, her braided hair cascading over her shoulders as she swung her legs over the edge of the bed. The coolness of the floor beneath her feet grounded her, but it didn't dull the trembling in her chest. Her wide, beautiful eyes stared blankly into the dimly lit room as a single thought pushed to the surface of her mind. Could it be? After years of heartbreak, years of negative tests, years of silent prayers and whispered pleas to a God she had sometimes doubted would ever hear her, was it possible that her prayers had finally been answered? Alicia's hands trembled as she stood and made her way toward the adjoining bathroom. Her steps were quick but shaky, the tension coiling in her chest making it hard to breathe. Her hand hovered over the drawer beneath the sink before she yanked it open, rifling through the neatly arranged toiletries until her fingers closed around the small white box she had bought months ago but had stopped using after too many heartbreaks. She pulled it out, her hands shaking violently as she peeled open the package. A pregnancy test, the same kind she had used dozens of times before, each one delivering the same crushing result: negative. But this time felt different. Alicia's breath quickened as she followed the instructions, her pulse thundering in her ears as she placed the test on the marble countertop and sat down on the edge of the bathtub. The seconds stretched into eternity as she stared at the tiny digital screen, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Don't hope, don't hope, don't hope. Her mind screamed at her, warning her not to let herself feel it. But the feeling in her chest, the warmth in her belly, refused to be ignored. Her vision blurred as tears welled up in her eyes, her heart thudding painfully in her chest as the screen flashed once, twice, before a single word appeared: positive. Alicia's breath escaped her in a broken sob as the realization crashed into her. Her hands shot to her mouth, her shoulders trembling as a flood of tears poured down her cheeks. Positive. The word repeated over and over in her mind, a deafening echo of hope and disbelief. "Oh my God," she whispered shakily, her voice cracking as tears streaked her cheeks. "Oh my God, it's real." Alicia slid off the edge of the bathtub and collapsed onto her knees on the cool marble floor. Her hands pressed flat against her abdomen as sobs racked her body. Years of praying, years of crying in silence, years of blaming herself and feeling like her body had betrayed her. It had all led to this moment. A miracle, a gift from God. "Thank you," she whispered brokenly, her forehead pressing against the cold floor as tears soaked the marble beneath her. "Thank you. Thank you." She didn't know how long she stayed there, her body trembling, her hands clutching her belly as if she were trying to hold on to the fragile hope blossoming inside her. But as the initial wave of disbelief began to fade, a new and painful realization began to creep beneath her skin. Chris, her husband, the man she had loved with every fiber of her being, the man who had just asked for a divorce. Alicia's stomach twisted painfully as the memory of Chris's cold words replayed in her mind. "I'm asking for a divorce. I need an heir. She'll give me what you couldn't." Alicia's tears stilled as her breath hitched in her throat. Chris had already chosen to leave. He had already made his decision. He was prepared to walk away from their marriage and replace her with someone else, a woman who could give him the child he so desperately wanted. And now Alicia was pregnant with the child he had longed for. A bitter knot of pain and irony tightened in her chest. "What am I supposed to do?" she thought wildly, her mind spinning. Should she tell him? Should she beg him to stay? A fresh wave of tears burned behind her eyes. No, she couldn't. Chris had already made it clear that love wasn't enough anymore. He had chosen to give up on her, to replace her. He had hurt her too deeply to undo the damage now. Alicia's trembling hands curled into fists as a quiet strength began to rise beneath the devastation. She couldn't tell him, not yet, not after everything. She wouldn't allow herself to become some desperate, pathetic woman begging for love. If Chris couldn't see her worth beyond her ability to bear him a child, then she would raise this child on her own. Her heart ached at the thought of it, raising a child alone, knowing Chris was out there starting a life with someone else. But she had no choice. Her tears slowed as a quiet determination filled her chest. "I can do this," she whispered to herself, her wide eyes shimmering with quiet strength as she pressed a hand protectively against her belly. "I will do this, for my baby." Alicia rose shakily to her feet, her breathing still ragged as she wiped her tear-streaked cheeks with the back of her hand. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, The pain etched into her features, the vulnerability in her eyes. But beneath it all, there was strength. A mother's strength. Alicia took the pregnancy test and held it in her hands for a long moment before setting it down on the counter with a soft click. Tomorrow, Chris would expect her to sign the divorce papers. He would expect her to hand over their life together without a fight. But he had no idea what tomorrow would bring. He had no idea that the child he had dreamed of for years, the heir he had believed Alicia could never give him, was growing inside her at that very moment. Alicia lifted her chin, her wide eyes hardening as she whispered fiercely, "He made his choice. Now I'm making mine." And with that she turned and walked out of the bathroom, her hand pressed to her belly, her heart pounding with the quiet resolve of a woman who had just discovered the miracle she had always prayed for, just in time for the man she loved to walk away. Alicia stood in the grand, echoing foyer of Chris's sprawling mansion, her heart pounding painfully in her chest as she stared at the gleaming marble floors beneath her feet. Sunlight streamed through the enormous glass windows, casting golden beams across the polished surfaces. But the light felt cold and distant, a cruel reminder of the emptiness that had settled between these walls. Her hand instinctively pressed against her belly, feeling the faint stir of life growing inside her. Her heart tightened painfully. "I'm doing this for you," she thought as her other hand tightened around the handle of her suitcase. The quiet hum of the mansion was deafening, the silence wrapping around her like a suffocating veil as she glanced toward the grand staircase, toward the rooms where she and Chris had once shared so many passionate nights, where they had laughed and dreamed of a future together. But those dreams had shattered the moment Chris had told her he wanted a divorce, and now she was pregnant with the very miracle he had always wanted. But he would never know. Not yet. Alicia took a shaky breath, her stunning brown eyes wide with quiet determination, as she turned toward the heavy wooden doors of the mansion. Her braids were pulled into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, and her smooth brown skin glowed beneath the soft sunlight filtering through the windows. Her heart felt like it was splintering with each step she took toward the exit, but she knew what she had to do. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't raise her child in a house where she had never been enough. Chris had made it clear that he wanted a woman who could give him an heir. And while Alicia now carried the child he had always dreamed of, it was too late. He had already given up on her. She couldn't beg him to love her, not anymore. The sting of rejection was still too raw, too deep. She stopped at the door, her slender fingers trembling as they curled around the brass handle. A sudden wave of nausea swept over her, and she inhaled deeply, pressing a hand to her stomach as her body adjusted to the new life growing within her. Her heart swelled with fierce protectiveness. If Chris couldn't love her without a child, then he didn't deserve to know about the miracle growing inside her now. "I'll do this on my own." Alicia pulled the door open, the warm breeze brushing across her skin as she stepped outside. A sleek black car was waiting at the edge of the driveway, her belongings already loaded into the trunk. The driver nodded respectfully as he opened the door for her. Alicia hesitated for a brief moment, glancing back at the mansion one last time. Memories flashed through her mind. Chris's deep laughter, the way his arms had wrapped around her waist late at night, the whispered promises beneath the stars. Her throat tightened painfully, but those promises had been broken, and now there was no turning back. Alicia stepped into the car, her chin lifting as the driver closed the door behind her. The engine rumbled to life and the car pulled away from the mansion's long, winding driveway. Alicia's heart twisted as the sprawling estate disappeared behind her. For 4 years, this had been her home. For 4 years, Chris had been her world. But now she had a new purpose, a greater purpose. Her baby. The car wound through the city streets until they reached a modest apartment building on the quieter side of town. Alicia stepped out of the car, clutching her small suitcase, as she gazed up at the aged brick exterior. It wasn't glamorous, not even close to the luxury she had grown accustomed to, but it was hers. A clean slate, a fresh start. Alicia took a steadying breath and climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor. Her apartment was small, one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room barely large enough for a couch. But it was cozy. Sunlight streamed through the narrow windows, casting warm streaks of light across the worn wooden floors. Alicia set her suitcase down near the door and took a moment to steady herself. Her hand drifted to her belly, a soft smile curving her lips, despite the lingering ache in her chest. "We're going to be okay," she whispered softly to the growing life inside her. "I promise you, baby. I'll take care of you. I'll give you the best life I can." Alicia spent the next few days settling into her new life. She applied for several jobs, determined to secure a stable income to support herself and her child. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Her experience was limited, and her pregnancy would soon become harder to hide. But Alicia was determined. She spent hours rewriting her resume, attending interviews, and calling potential employers. The rejection emails and polite declines began to pile up, but Alicia refused to let discouragement take root. She sat at the small kitchen table one evening, her laptop open in front of her as the soft glow of the screen reflected in her wide eyes. A deep exhaustion settled in her bones, but she refused to give in. She had always been strong. Now she had even more reason to fight. One afternoon, after several failed interviews, Alicia received a phone call. Her heart pounded as she answered. "Miss Alicia," a warm female voice said on the other end of the line. "We were impressed by your interview. If you're still interested, we'd like to offer you the position." Alicia's breath caught. Relief and joy swept through her as her hand pressed instinctively to her belly. "Yes," she said quickly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I'd love to accept." "Wonderful. We'll see you Monday morning." Alicia hung up the phone and covered her face with her hands as tears welled in her eyes. "I did it." She sat back in the worn dining chair, her heart still hammering with excitement. She had a job, a steady income. She was building a future for herself and her baby without Chris's help. Alicia pressed her hand to her stomach, tears slipping down her cheeks as a soft smile curved her lips. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "I'm going to make sure of it." Despite the uncertainty of her future and the heartache that lingered in her chest, Alicia felt stronger than she ever had before. She didn't need Chris's money. She didn't need his mansion. All she needed was her baby and the fierce love that was already growing between them. And as Alicia lay down that night in her modest new apartment, her hand resting protectively over her belly, she realized that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the future. She was ready to face it head-on, with or without Chris Wakes by her side. Chris Wakes sat alone in the grand yet eerily quiet mansion, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands buried in his thick, dark hair as the weight of his decisions crushed him from the inside out. The once lively house, which had been filled with Alicia's gentle laughter and the soft hum of her presence, now felt like a hollow tomb, cold and lifeless despite the wealth and beauty surrounding him. The expansive marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of the crystal chandeliers, but they reflected nothing but emptiness back at him. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the breathtaking view of the city skyline, but even that had lost its appeal. His chest tightened painfully as the silence pressed down on him. For years, Chris had believed that success and legacy were the most important things in life. He had built an empire with his bare hands, turning a modest inheritance into a thriving business that stretched across continents. His sharp business acumen, relentless drive, and impeccable instincts had made him one of the most powerful and influential men in the world. But all the money and power in the world couldn't fill the aching void in his chest, now that Alicia was gone. He rubbed his hands over his face, his jaw tightening as his mind replayed the last conversation they'd had. The memory cut through him like a knife. He had sat Alicia down on the very couch he now sat on, looked into her wide, stunning brown eyes, eyes that had always shone with love and vulnerability, and told her he wanted a divorce. He had crushed her. He had watched the light dim from her gaze as his cold words struck her heart. He had convinced himself that he needed an heir, that Alicia's inability to give him a child was a flaw, an obstacle to the future he had envisioned for himself. And so, in his desperation and arrogance, he had decided to replace her with his secretary, believing that finding a more suitable woman would solve his problem. But the moment Alicia walked out of the mansion with her suitcase in hand, Chris's heart had begun to unravel. He had stood at the window watching as the sleek black car pulled away, carrying the woman he had promised to love forever. He hadn't realized how cold and empty the house would feel without her soft footsteps echoing down the marble hallways, without the sound of her voice humming quietly from the kitchen as she brewed her morning coffee. The scent of her favorite vanilla candle still lingered faintly in the air, torturing him with her absence. Days turned into nights, and Chris found himself haunted by the ghost of his own mistakes. He couldn't sleep. The massive king-sized bed felt too large and too cold without Alicia curled up beside him. He would wake up in the middle of the night, instinctively reaching out for her, only to be met with empty sheets. He couldn't eat. The meals prepared by the private chef tasted like ash in his mouth. He sat at the long dining table, surrounded by expensive china and fine silverware, but his appetite was gone. The mansion that had once represented power and success now felt like a prison, each room a painful reminder of what he had thrown away. His secretary had called him several times, but Chris found himself unable to answer. The thought of being with another woman now felt impossible. How could he have ever believed that replacing Alicia was the answer? He began to drown himself in work, spending long hours at the office to escape the emptiness of his home. But even the business deals and financial victories that once gave him satisfaction now felt meaningless. His mind would drift during meetings, his eyes glazing over as memories of Alicia flashed through his mind. Her radiant smile when she greeted him at the door, the softness of her lips when she kissed him goodnight, the way she would curl up next to him and whisper about her day. His chest ached with longing, with regret. He had made the biggest mistake of his life, and there was no way to undo it. And then, one evening, everything changed. Chris had been sitting in his office, staring blankly at his laptop, when his phone buzzed. It was a message from an old mutual friend, someone who still kept in touch with Alicia. "Did you hear? Alicia's pregnant." Chris's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat as he reread the message, his hand trembling. Pregnant. Alicia was pregnant. With his child. His chest tightened painfully as the realization slammed into him like a freight train. Alicia had been pregnant when she left him, and he hadn't known. He had thrown her away, abandoned her when she had been carrying the very miracle he had been desperate for all these years. His vision blurred with emotion as he stood abruptly, knocking over the glass of whiskey on his desk. The amber liquid spilled across the papers and wood, but Chris didn't care. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the erratic pounding of his heart beneath his tailored shirt. A wave of raw guilt surged through him, twisting his insides. He had accused Alicia of failing him, of being incapable of giving him the one thing he needed. He had hurt her, pushed her away, only to discover that she had been carrying his child all along. And she hadn't told him. Why would she? After how he had treated her, after the cold way he had discarded her, why would Alicia believe that he deserved to know? Chris sank down onto the leather chair behind his desk, his hands shaking as he dragged them through his hair. He had been such a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. He had destroyed the most important thing in his life, his marriage his relationship with the woman who had stood by him through everything because of his selfish need for an heir. And now Alicia was out there, alone, preparing to raise their child without him. The thought of Alicia struggling, of her facing the stress of pregnancy and single motherhood without his support, nearly crushed him. He pictured her sitting alone in a small apartment, working tirelessly to provide for a baby that he had desperately wanted. His jaw clenched, his heart burned with the weight of his guilt and failure. He had to fix this. He had to make it right. Chris stood abruptly, his eyes blazing with newfound determination. He couldn't lose Alicia. Not now, not after realizing how deeply he still loved her. He had been wrong to measure her value based on her ability to give him a child. She had always been enough. He had just been too blind to see it. And now he had a second chance, not just with Alicia, but with their child. He wasn't going to waste it. Chris grabbed his keys and his jacket, his heart thundering with desperate resolve. He needed to find Alicia. He needed to beg for her forgiveness. And this time he wouldn't stop until he earned it. He had lost her once. He wouldn't make the same mistake again. Chris's heart pounded violently in his chest as he stood outside Alicia's modest apartment door, his breath ragged and his hands trembling with desperation. His expensive Italian shoes felt out of place against the worn-out welcome mat beneath his feet, and the peeling paint on the door was a stark reminder of how far Alicia had fallen from the life of comfort and luxury he had once provided, and how deeply he had failed her. His knuckles hovered over the door for a long moment, paralyzed by the crushing weight of his guilt and the fear that Alicia might refuse to even look at him. But the image of her alone, pregnant with his child, forced him to gather his courage. His hand trembled as he finally knocked, each hollow sound reverberating through his chest like an echo of his own broken heart. Seconds stretched into an eternity before the door creaked open, and there she stood, Alicia. Her wide brown eyes stared up at him, the exhaustion in them cutting him deeper than any blade ever could. She looked thinner, more fragile than he remembered, her once glowing skin slightly pale, the dark circles beneath her eyes a testament to sleepless nights and silent battles fought alone. Her braided hair was tied back loosely, and she wore a simple gray t-shirt over black leggings, her figure softened by the small but unmistakable curve of her pregnant belly. Chris's eyes burned as he took her in, guilt slamming into him so hard his knees almost gave out. His mouth parted, but no words came out at first, just the sharp sting of unshed tears clogging his throat. "Chris." Alicia's voice was cautious, guarded, and there was a chill beneath the softness of it that made his stomach turn. He stepped forward, his hands instinctively reaching toward her, but she flinched, her arms curling protectively over her belly. That small, instinctive gesture nearly destroyed him. His breath hitched painfully as he sank to his knees before her, his hands pressing against the rough wood of the floor as his head bowed in shame. "Alicia." His voice cracked under the weight of his own remorse. "Please, please listen to me." He lifted his head, his blue eyes glistening with tears as he stared up at her. "I'm so sorry. I was blind. I was selfish. I let my desperation and my pride cloud my judgment, and I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to forgive myself for." He took a shaky breath, his hands curling into fists against the floor. I thought having an heir was the most important thing. I convinced myself that I needed a child to carry on my legacy, to prove my success. But I was wrong. So painfully wrong. You were always enough. You were the legacy I should have cherished. You were the gift I should have held on to. A single tear slid down his cheek as he shook his head, his chest heaving. "And now, you're pregnant. With our child. The very thing I thought I wanted so desperately. But I threw you away before I even knew. I failed you as a husband, Alicia. I abandoned you when you needed me the most. And now I'm terrified that I've lost you forever." Alicia's lips trembled, her eyes shining with emotion, but the pain beneath them was still raw, still open. "You hurt me, Chris," she whispered. Her hands trembled over her stomach. "You made me feel like I wasn't enough, like I was broken." Chris's breath came out in a shaky sob as he knelt up, his hands hovering over her belly but not daring to touch. "You were never broken, Alicia. It was me. I was the broken one. I thought that success and power were everything, but you were the thing that kept me whole. And when I lost you, I realized how empty my life was without you in it." He swallowed hard, his hands finally rising to rest lightly on her hips. "Please, I know I don't deserve it. I know I've done the unforgivable, but I'm begging you. Please give me a second chance. Let me be the husband you deserve. Let me be the father our child deserves. I swear to you I will spend every day for the rest of my life making this right." Alicia's eyes brimmed with tears, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she processed his words. Her hands clutched at the hem of her shirt, her gaze flicking down to his trembling hands on her hips. Her body ached with the memory of the nights she had cried herself to sleep, the long, empty hours she had spent wondering why she wasn't enough for him. But here he was now, stripped of his arrogance and pride, kneeling before her like a broken man, begging for forgiveness. A tear slipped down her cheek as she whispered, "How do I know you won't hurt me again?" Chris's hands slid from her hips to her waist, his fingers trembling as he tilted his head up to meet her gaze. "Because I've already lived through the worst pain of my life, losing you. And I can't survive that again. I can't lose you. I can't lose our child." His hands moved to cradle her belly, his thumbs brushing over the curve of her stomach with reverence. Alicia stiffened at first, her breath catching as his hands spread protectively across the life growing inside her. Chris's gaze darkened with fierce emotion as he said, This is everything to me. You and our baby. Nothing else matters anymore. Not the business, not the legacy. None of it means anything without you." His voice thickened with raw desperation. "Please, come home. Let me take care of you. Let me prove to you that I can be the man you need me to be, that I can be the father our child needs." Alicia's chest tightened painfully as Chris pressed a soft kiss against her belly, his lips trembling against her skin through the thin fabric of her shirt. His sincerity poured into every word, every touch. Tears blurred her vision as her hands lifted, threading gently through his dark hair. Chris's eyes fluttered shut at her touch, and a tear slipped down his cheek. His heart hammered in his chest as Alicia whispered, "I'm scared." Chris's eyes opened and his hands tightened around her waist. "I know," he whispered, "but you don't have to be scared alone. Not anymore. I'll stand by you, every step of the way. I swear on my life, Alicia, I will never let you face anything alone again." A sob escaped Alicia's throat as Chris rose to his feet, his arms wrapping around her carefully, protectively. He pressed his forehead to hers, his breath mingling with hers as he whispered, "Please, let me come home." Alicia's walls began to crumble as her hand slid over his chest, feeling the frantic beat of his heart beneath her palm. Chris's lips brushed her forehead, then her cheek, before finally pressing against her mouth with quiet desperation. Alicia's arms curled around his neck as tears ran down her face, her lips parting beneath his. When he pulled back, his gaze was dark with emotion, his breath ragged. "Come home with me," he pleaded. Alicia hesitated for only a moment longer before finally whispering, "Okay." Chris's breath hitched, his heart pounding wildly as he cupped her face. Relief and love surged through him as he kissed her again, deeper this time, pouring every ounce of his remorse, devotion, and love into her trembling lips. He would spend the rest of his life making it up to her. He had a second chance, and he wouldn't waste it. Chris refused to let go of the hope that Alicia would forgive him. After the day he had poured his heart out and begged for a second chance, he knew the road to redemption would be long and difficult, but he was prepared to walk it, no matter how hard or how painful it became. He had made a decision that day, standing on his knees before Alicia, holding her belly with the fragile life growing inside it, and he vowed that he would spend every breath proving to her that he had changed, that he was worthy of her love and trust again. He began with quiet, consistent actions, knowing that words alone would never be enough. The very next morning, after their emotional confrontation, he sent a warm breakfast to her apartment, an assortment of fresh fruit, whole grain toast, eggs, and her favorite herbal tea. Alicia was hesitant to accept it at first, but when she opened the note attached to the tray that simply said, "Take care of yourself and our baby," her chest tightened. That same day, Chris called her to check on how she was feeling, his voice soft and careful as though he was afraid of scaring her away. Alicia kept her responses short, guarded, but Chris never pushed. He respected her boundaries, knowing that her heart was still fragile. A week later, he showed up unannounced at her doctor's appointment. Alicia had been sitting nervously in the waiting room, clutching her belly as the reality of her pregnancy settled in more deeply. When she saw Chris walk in, dressed in a tailored suit, but with his hair slightly tousled and his eyes burning with quiet determination, her heart skipped a beat. He sat beside her without saying a word, his hand resting lightly over hers. Alicia hesitated, but when the nurse called her name, Chris stood with her, his hand tightening protectively around hers as he whispered, "I'm coming with you." Tears pricked the back of her eyes as he walked with her into the exam room, standing beside her as the doctor performed the ultrasound. When the small, rapid thump of their baby's heartbeat filled the room, Alicia's breath hitched and Chris's hand tightened over hers. His blue eyes darkened with emotion as he stared at the screen, his jaw clenching to keep his composure. Later that day, he sent her a bouquet of soft pink roses with a note that simply said, "Thank you for letting me be there." Alicia's walls, carefully built from years of hurt and disappointment, began to crack beneath the steady warmth of his actions. Chris started showing up for every appointment after that, making sure he never missed a single one. He was there when they learned the baby's gender, a girl, and when the doctor assured them that the pregnancy was progressing well. After each appointment, he would take her out for lunch, carefully ordering whatever she was craving without even asking, because he had been paying close attention to what she liked and what made her nauseous. He began anticipating her needs before she voiced them. One evening, Alicia was feeling particularly unwell. Morning sickness mixed with exhaustion left her curled up on the couch, clutching her stomach. She hesitated before calling Chris, but when he picked up on the first ring, his worried voice calmed her. "I'll be right there," he said, and true to his word, he showed up 10 minutes later with ginger tea and warm soup. He sat beside her, pressing his palm against her belly, whispering soothing words until she relaxed against him. Alicia's heart softened further when Chris began handling practical things without her asking. He quietly covered her rent for the next 3 months, settled her utility bills, and even stocked her fridge with fresh fruits and vegetables. Alicia noticed how he no longer approached her with desperation or guilt. His actions were grounded in quiet sincerity. One evening, she woke to find him asleep on her couch. He had shown up earlier to help her assemble the crib for the baby and had fallen asleep with the instruction manual still in his hand. Alicia stood in the doorway, watching him sleep, her chest tightening painfully at the realization that this man who had broken her heart, was now working tirelessly to earn her trust back. But what struck her most was how patient Chris was. He never rushed her, never pressured her, and never once asked her to move back into the mansion. Instead, he showed up every day in small ways, proving that he was there to stay. When Alicia's baby bump grew more pronounced, Chris became even more protective of her. He would place his hand over her belly, feeling the gentle movements of their daughter. His eyes would darken with wonder, and Alicia could see the quiet awe in his expression. "She's strong," he whispered one night, his hand resting over her bump as they sat on her small couch. "Just like her mother." Alicia's heart twisted painfully at the tenderness in his voice. Slowly, her guard began to lower. One evening, Chris took her to a quiet dinner at a small Italian restaurant, the same place they had shared their first date years ago. Alicia hesitated when he reached across the table to take her hand, but when his thumb brushed over her knuckles, the warmth of his touch stirred something familiar and painful in her chest. "Alicia," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I know I hurt you, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I love you. I love you more now than I ever have. Not because you're giving me a child, but because you've shown me strength and grace even when I didn't deserve it. I'm not asking you to trust me overnight. I just want the chance to love you the way you deserve to be loved." Alicia's eyes filled with tears as Chris lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles. After months of patient devotion, quiet acts of love, and unwavering consistency, Alicia's heart finally opened. One night, as Chris sat beside her, his hand resting protectively over her belly, Alicia turned toward him. Her brown eyes were soft with vulnerability as she whispered, "Chris, I'm scared." Chris's hand slid up to cup her cheek. "I know," he whispered, "but you don't have to be scared alone. Not anymore." Alicia's throat tightened painfully. Slowly, she leaned toward him, resting her forehead against his. Chris's breath hitched, his eyes burning as her arm slipped around his neck. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm ready to give you another chance." Chris's heart stopped, his breath catching as her words sank in. A tear slid down his cheek as his arms wrapped around her, holding her tightly. "Thank you," he breathed against her temple. "I swear, I will never take you for granted again." Alicia's lips curled into a small smile as Chris pressed his forehead to hers. That night, for the first time in months, Alicia felt safe in his arms. Chris stayed with her that night, falling asleep with his hand resting protectively over her belly. When Alicia woke the next morning, Chris was still there, his breathing soft and even beside her. A quiet peace settled over Alicia's heart. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but this time they would face it together. Chris had proven his love not with words, but with quiet, consistent actions. And Alicia was finally ready to open her heart to the man who had once broken it. This time they would build a future not out of obligation, but out of love. Chris knew that words alone would never be enough to heal the wounds he had caused, so he decided to show Alicia with his actions, through tenderness, love, and the kind of devotion that could only be felt, not spoken. He spent days planning the perfect evening, down to the smallest detail, because he wanted Alicia to feel cherished, adored, and desired in a way she hadn't felt in years. That evening, Chris arrived at Alicia's apartment, dressed in a tailored black suit. The crisp white shirt beneath it opened slightly at the collar. His blue eyes darkened with quiet determination as he knocked on her door. When Alicia opened it, her breath caught. He looked devastatingly handsome, but it wasn't just his appearance. It was the softness in his gaze, the quiet vulnerability that made her pulse quicken. He smiled as he held out a single red rose. "Come with me," he whispered, his voice low and deep. Alicia hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his face, but the warmth in his gaze and the gentleness of his touch dissolved her uncertainty. She took the rose, her fingers brushing against his as he guided her toward the sleek black car waiting outside. Chris opened the door for her, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back as she slid into the plush leather seat. The drive was quiet, but the air between them was charged with tension, an electric pull that neither of them could ignore. Chris's hand rested over hers as he drove, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a slow, deliberate rhythm. After a short drive, the car pulled up to a private villa surrounded by lush gardens and twinkling fairy lights. Chris helped Alicia out of the car, his hand steady and protective as he led her down a stone path lined with flickering lanterns. At the end of the path was a beautifully set table beneath a canopy of stars. White linen draped over the table, surrounded by cascading red roses and glowing candles. Alicia's eyes widened in awe. "Chris," she whispered, her voice trembling. He smiled as he pulled out her chair and guided her to sit down. "You deserve to be treated like a queen," he said softly, his gaze never leaving hers. A private waiter brought out a meal of Alicia's favorite dishes: creamy risotto, garlic butter shrimp, roasted vegetables, and a delicate dessert of chocolate mousse. Chris watched her with quiet intensity as she took small bites, his heart tightening every time her lips curved into a soft smile. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Alicia," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you don't know how much I regret what I did. I was blind and selfish, but I promise you, I am not the same man I was then. I know it will take time for you to trust me again, but I will spend the rest of my life proving to you that I deserve your love." Alicia's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Chris," she whispered, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. Chris stood and moved toward her, pulling her gently to her feet. He slipped his arms around her waist, drawing her close. Soft music began to play, a slow, intimate melody that wrapped around them like a warm embrace. Chris's hands slid down her back as he began to sway with her beneath the stars. Alicia rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady thud of his heart beneath her ear. Chris lowered his head, pressing his lips to her hair. "Let me love you, Alicia," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "Let me make up for every mistake I made." Alicia's breath hitched as his hand slid up her spine, his fingers tangling in the back of her hair. His lips found her temple, then her cheek, trailing soft, reverent kisses across her skin. Alicia's eyes fluttered closed as Chris's mouth brushed over her ear. "Come with me," he whispered. He led her into the villa, guiding her toward a room lit only by the soft glow of candles. Rose petals were scattered across the white silk sheets of the king-sized bed, and the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and roses. Chris turned toward Alicia, his hands trembling as he cupped her face. His eyes darkened with emotion as he brushed his thumb over her cheek. "You're so beautiful," he whispered. Alicia's breath hitched as Chris lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was slow and tentative at first, an unspoken question. But when Alicia's hands slid up his chest, curling into the fabric of his shirt, Chris deepened the kiss. His tongue slid past her lips, claiming her mouth with a quiet desperation that made Alicia's knees weaken. Chris's hands skimmed down her sides, his touch reverent and careful, as though he was afraid of breaking her. Alicia moaned softly as his mouth left hers and trailed down her neck, his teeth grazing her skin. Chris's hands slid beneath the soft fabric of her dress, lifting it over her head and leaving her exposed beneath the dim candlelight. His eyes darkened as he took in the soft curve of her growing belly. "You're perfect," he breathed. Alicia's hands trembled as she reached for him, unbuttoning his shirt with shaking fingers. Chris watched her with quiet intensity as she pushed the fabric off his shoulders, revealing the taut muscle beneath. He lowered her onto the bed, his hands framing her face as he kissed her deeply. His lips traced a path down her neck, across her collarbone, and lower still. Alicia's breath hitched as Chris's hands caressed the swell of her belly, his mouth worshipping every inch of her. He kissed the gentle curve of her stomach, his hands spreading possessively over her hips. "You're carrying our baby," he whispered, his voice thick with awe. "You've given me more than I ever deserved." Alicia's heart twisted painfully at the raw emotion in his voice. She reached for him, her fingers threading through his hair as Chris moved over her, his mouth finding hers again. Their bodies molded together beneath the sheets, and Chris moved with aching slowness, his hands cradling her face as though she were something fragile and sacred. Alicia gasped as Chris's mouth claimed her again and again, his touch both reverent and possessive. He whispered her name between each kiss, his breath hot against her skin. "I love you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I love you so much." Alicia's eyes filled with tears as Chris's hands slid down her body, memorizing every curve, every soft, breathless sound she made. Their bodies moved together, finding a rhythm that spoke of forgiveness and healing. Chris held her afterward, his arms wrapped protectively around her as his breath slowed. Alicia rested her head against his chest, her heart thrumming wildly beneath her skin. Chris brushed his lips over her hair. "I'm never letting you go again," he whispered. Alicia smiled softly as her hand rested over his heart. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered back. Chris's arms tightened around her as sleep pulled them both under, and for the first time in months, Alicia felt truly safe. They had faced heartbreak, separation, and the weight of past mistakes. But now, wrapped in each other's arms, they were finally whole again. Alicia woke up to a sharp pain tearing through her body, and for a moment confusion clouded her mind. Then, as the next wave of pain crashed through her, reality struck. She was in labor. Her breath hitched as she sat up in bed, clutching her swollen belly as the contraction ripped through her. "Chris," she gasped, her face contorting in pain. Within seconds, Chris was by her side, his hand cradling her face, his eyes wide with panic and fierce determination. "Alicia, it's time," he asked breathlessly, his heart hammering violently in his chest. Alicia nodded, sweat beading across her forehead. "It's happening," she whispered, her voice trembling. Chris didn't hesitate. He scooped her into his arms and rushed to the car, his heart thudding painfully with fear and anticipation. As he drove toward the hospital, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, he kept glancing toward Alicia, watching the way her face twisted with pain as another contraction seized her. "Breathe, baby, breathe," Chris said, his voice breaking with helplessness. "I'm right here, just hold on a little longer." Alicia squeezed his hand, her nails digging into his skin as she whimpered. "Chris, it hurts." "I know, baby, I know," Chris whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he pressed his lips to her hand. "We're almost there." By the time they reached the hospital, Chris was shaking. Nurses rushed toward them with a wheelchair, but Chris refused to let go of Alicia. "I've got her," he growled, his eyes blazing with fierce protectiveness as he carried her through the entrance. "My wife is in labor. Help her." Doctors and nurses guided them toward the delivery room, but Chris never left Alicia's side. He held her hand tightly as she lay on the hospital bed, her face pale, her eyes squeezed shut against the pain. "You're doing so well, baby," Chris whispered, brushing damp strands of hair away from her face. "I'm so proud of you." Alicia's eyes fluttered open, glistening with tears as another contraction seized her body. "Chris, I don't think I can do this." "Yes, you can," Chris said fiercely, his hand cupping her cheek. "You are the strongest woman I've ever known. You can do this. I'm right here with you, Alicia. I'm not going anywhere." Alicia's breath hitched as Chris kissed her forehead, his thumb stroking her cheek. "Push, Alicia," the doctor commanded. Alicia screamed as pain ripped through her body, but Chris's voice was steady in her ear. "Come on, baby. Push. Just one more time. You've got this. I'm right here." Alicia squeezed his hand, her knuckles turning white as she pushed with every ounce of strength left in her body. Chris's heart thudded violently as he watched Alicia's face contort with agony. But then, suddenly, a thin, sharp cry filled the room. "It's a boy," the doctor announced. Chris's breath left his body in a rush as he stared at the tiny, writhing infant cradled in the doctor's hands. Tears filled Chris's eyes as he watched the nurse place the baby against Alicia's chest. Alicia's breath caught as she stared down at the tiny, perfect face of their newborn son. His small fists curled tightly as he let out a soft cry, his mouth opening and closing as he adjusted to the world. "Oh my God," Alicia whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks as she stroked his delicate face. "Chris, he's perfect." Chris's hands were shaking as he brushed his thumb over the baby's tiny hand. "He's so small," he breathed, his chest tightening painfully. The nurse smiled as she carefully handed the baby to Chris. Chris hesitated for a brief second before he gathered the tiny bundle into his arms. The moment his son's soft body settled against his chest, Chris's heart broke wide open. A sharp, piercing love filled his chest, so intense it nearly stole his breath. "Hey there, little guy," Chris whispered, his voice breaking as tears slipped down his cheeks. "I'm your daddy." The baby let out a soft coo, his small hand curling around Chris's finger. Chris's throat tightened as he kissed his son's head, his lips brushing against the downy softness of his hair. "He's so perfect," Chris whispered, his eyes burning with tears. "Just like his mother." Alicia smiled weakly, her eyes shimmering with exhaustion and joy as she watched Chris hold their son. "He looks like you," Alicia whispered. Chris smiled through his tears. "He's got your eyes," he said softly, brushing his thumb over the baby's cheek. The baby opened his eyes for the first time, and Chris's breath hitched. Deep brown eyes, the same shade as Alicia's, stared up at him with quiet curiosity. Chris's heart swelled with emotion as he kissed the baby's forehead. "Thank you," Chris whispered, his gaze meeting Alicia's, "for giving me the greatest gift of my life." Alicia's eyes filled with tears as Chris sat down beside her on the hospital bed, their baby nestled safely in his arms. Chris leaned down and kissed Alicia deeply, his hand sliding into her hair. "I love you," he whispered, "and I love him. You've made me the happiest man in the world." Alicia smiled, her heart full. "I love you too, Chris." Chris held the baby close, feeling the steady rhythm of his tiny heart beneath his fingertips. He realized in that moment that nothing else mattered. Not the business empire, not the pressure of legacy. This was his family, his home, his life. He would spend every day making sure they were safe, happy, and loved. Chris's heart swelled as he watched Alicia drift into sleep, her hand resting protectively over the baby's small body. His son's tiny fingers curled tightly around his thumb, and Chris smiled. "You're safe now," he whispered. "Daddy's got you, and I'll never let you go." As Chris watched his wife and son sleep, he felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. He had made mistakes, but fate had given him a second chance. And this time, he wouldn't fail. He would protect Alicia and their son with everything he had. Chris kissed the baby's head one last time before leaning back against the pillow. His heart, for the first time in years, felt whole. And as he drifted to sleep with his family in his arms, Chris knew this was the beginning of a beautiful new chapter. Chris had been planning the surprise for weeks, making countless calls to ensure every detail was perfect. Alicia had no idea what he was up to until one evening when Chris walked into the living room with a wide grin and an envelope in his hand. Their baby boy was sleeping soundly in his crib, and Alicia was curled up on the couch in her favorite oversized sweater. Chris sat beside her, his hand brushing through her hair as he handed her the envelope. "What's this?" Alicia asked, raising an eyebrow as she sat up. Chris's smile widened as he leaned in, brushing a soft kiss against her cheek. "Open it and find out," he whispered. Alicia's heart fluttered as she opened the envelope and pulled out 2 plane tickets. Her eyes widened when she read the destination. "Paris?" she breathed, her gaze snapping to Chris in disbelief. "You're taking me to Paris?" Chris's eyes softened as he cupped her face. "Not just you," he said. "Our son, too. I want us to start fresh, Alicia. a new beginning in the most romantic city in the world. Just the three of us. Tears welled in Alicia's eyes as Chris kissed her tenderly. Chris, this is perfect, Chris finished, his lips curling into a smile. Because you and our son are my everything now. I want to give you both the world. A week later, Chris, Alicia, and their baby boy were stepping off a private jet in Paris. The city was bathed in golden sunlight, the soft hum of street life surrounding them as Chris helped Alicia into a waiting car. Their baby was nestled securely in Chris's arms, his tiny hand wrapped around his father's finger. "Welcome to Paris, Mrs. Evans," Chris whispered as the car pulled away from the airport. Alicia's eyes sparkled with wonder as the breathtaking Parisian architecture unfolded before her. Chris had reserved a luxurious suite at one of the finest hotels overlooking the Eiffel Tower. When they arrived, Alicia gasped at the sheer elegance of the room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, the Eiffel Tower glowing against the evening sky. Rose petals were scattered across the king-sized bed, and a chilled bottle of champagne sat waiting by the window. "Chris," Alicia whispered, her eyes wide. Chris smiled as he placed their baby in a crib beside the bed. He walked toward Alicia, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Do you like it?" he murmured. Alicia turned in his arms, her eyes shining. "It's beautiful." Chris kissed her forehead, his hands settling on her waist. "Not as beautiful as you," he whispered. The next morning, they strolled through the cobbled streets of Paris. Hand in hand, Chris pushed the stroller with their son, nestled comfortably inside, his chubby cheeks flushed from the cool morning air. Alicia smiled as they stopped at a charming cafe, sitting beneath a red-striped awning, while the aroma of freshly baked pastries filled the air. Chris ordered Alicia's favorite croissant and coffee, feeding her bites with a teasing smile as their baby cooed happily in the stroller. "Look at him," Chris said softly, his gaze lingering on their son's face. "He's perfect." Alicia's heart swelled as Chris reached across the table and took her hand. "I never thought I could be this happy," Chris whispered. "You've given me everything, Alicia. A family, love, a reason to be a better man." Alicia's eyes softened as she leaned in, brushing her lips against his knuckles. "And you've given me strength," she said. "You've shown me what love truly means." That evening, Chris arranged for a private dinner beneath the Eiffel Tower. The iron structure glowed against the dark sky, shimmering with golden lights. A small table was set with candles and white linens, and soft violin music floated through the air. Chris pulled out a chair for Alicia and helped her sit, his gaze lingering on the curve of her smile. "Chris, this is magical," Alicia whispered. Chris smiled as he poured them each a glass of champagne. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass. Alicia clinked her glass against his. "To love," she added softly. Their baby slept peacefully in the stroller beside them as Chris reached across the table and laced his fingers with Alicia's. "I made so many mistakes," Chris said, his voice low. "But you stayed. You forgave me, and you gave me a second chance. I swear, Alicia, I'm never letting you go again." Alicia's heart fluttered as Chris stood and extended his hand. "Dance with me," he whispered. Alicia smiled as she placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her beneath the Eiffel Tower. Chris wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close as they swayed beneath the stars. "I love you," Chris murmured against her ear. "I love you so much." Alicia closed her eyes as Chris's lips trailed down her neck. "I love you too," she whispered. Chris smiled as he rested his forehead against hers. "We're a family now, Alicia. Forever." Alicia's eyes shimmered with tears as Chris kissed her deeply, pouring every ounce of his love into that single kiss. When they pulled apart, Chris glanced down at their sleeping baby. "He's our miracle," Chris whispered. Alicia smiled. And you're mine, she replied softly. Chris's heart swelled as he pulled Alicia into his arms. Beneath the glittering lights of the Eiffel Tower, Chris knew that this was the life he had always dreamed of. Not the business empire, not the wealth, but this, Alicia, their son, love, family. This was his forever. It was a warm afternoon in the heart of spring, the sun casting a golden glow over the park as Chris sat on a weathered wooden bench with Alicia nestled securely in his arms. Their baby boy lay cradled in a soft blue blanket in Alicia's lap, his tiny chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of peaceful sleep. The sound of children laughing and birds chirping filled the air, mingling with the scent of fresh grass and blooming flowers. Chris's heart swelled as he tightened his arms around Alicia, his chin resting gently atop her head as his gaze softened on their son's peaceful face. Alicia's hand rested over Chris's, her fingers intertwining with his as they both watched their child with a shared sense of awe and gratitude. Chris's mind drifted back to the turbulent journey that had brought them here, to this perfect, quiet moment of peace. He had nearly lost it all, driven by his own fear and desperation to fulfill the legacy he thought he needed. He had been so blinded by his longing for a child that he had pushed away the very person who mattered most. Chris sighed, brushing his lips against Alicia's temple as his chest tightened with regret. "Thank you for giving me a second chance," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Alicia's eyes glimmered with unshed tears as she turned her face toward him, her expression soft and full of warmth. "You don't have to thank me," she whispered, her hand lifting to cradle his cheek. "Love is about forgiveness, and sometimes God's blessings come when we least expect them." Chris's throat tightened as Alicia's thumb brushed over his jawline. He could still remember the dark, cold nights after Alicia had left, the emptiness of the mansion without her laughter, the hollowness of his life without her presence. He had convinced himself he was doing the right thing by letting her go, but deep down he had known he was making the greatest mistake of his life. The news of Alicia's pregnancy had shaken him to his core, opening his eyes to the precious gift he had carelessly tossed aside. And yet, even after all the pain he had caused, Alicia had found the strength to forgive him, to welcome him back into her heart and allow him to be part of their child's life. "I didn't deserve your forgiveness," Chris murmured, his hand sliding beneath Alicia's hair to cradle the back of her neck. "I hurt you so much. I nearly lost everything." Alicia's eyes softened as her fingertips brushed his lips. "We all make mistakes," she said softly. "But love isn't about being perfect. It's about growing together, even through the hard times." Chris's chest constricted as Alicia's words settled deep in his heart. He had spent so many years believing that success, power, and legacy were the key to fulfillment. But none of those things had filled the emptiness he felt until Alicia had entered his life. It wasn't the business empire that defined him. It was the family he had created with the woman sitting beside him. Chris glanced down at their baby boy, his tiny fingers curled into delicate fists. His heart swelled with fierce protectiveness and love as he leaned down to gently kiss his son's forehead. "He's the most precious gift I've ever been given," Chris whispered. Alicia smiled as her gaze softened on their son's sleeping face. "He's a miracle," she said. "But so are you, Chris. You've changed so much. The man sitting beside me right now, the man holding his son with so much tenderness, that's the man I always believed you could be." Chris's throat tightened as Alicia's words sank in. He had been so broken, so lost in his pursuit of perfection, that he hadn't realized that true strength lay in vulnerability, in opening his heart fully and completely to the love that Alicia had always offered him. Chris's hand slid over Alicia's, his fingers brushing over the wedding ring that still glinted on her finger. "I'll never make that mistake again," he vowed. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you and our son feel how much I love you." "I promise, Alicia's eyes shimmered with tears as she leaned into his touch. I don't need perfection, Chris, she whispered. I just need you. Chris's heart thudded painfully as Alicia pressed her lips to his knuckles. And you have me, he said fiercely. Forever. Alicia's smile broke through her tears as Chris's arms tightened around her. Their son stirred in her lap, his mouth twitching into a soft smile as he drifted in and out of sleep. Chris watched his son with awe, marveling at the tiny life they had created together. He leaned down and kissed Alicia's forehead, his lips lingering against her skin. You saved me, Chris whispered. You showed me what love really means. Alicia smiled through her tears as her hand cupped his face. You saved me too, she whispered, because now I know. Love isn't about getting everything you want. It's about holding on through the storms and finding your way back to each other. Chris's chest tightened as Alicia's words settled deep within him. He had spent so long searching for happiness in the wrong places, but now, with Alicia in his arms and their son sleeping peacefully between them, he finally understood what true happiness felt like. We're a family now, Chris whispered, his gaze locking with Alicia's. And nothing will ever change that. Alicia smiled as Chris pressed his forehead to hers. Faith brought us here, she said softly. Faith and love. Chris's heart swelled as Alicia's words echoed through him. He had been so consumed by his own fear and insecurity that he had nearly lost the one person who had always stood by him. But God had given him a second chance, a chance to become the husband and father he was always meant to be. Chris pressed a tender kiss to Alicia's lips as their son stirred in his sleep. You're everything to me, Chris whispered. You and our son. You're my whole world. Alicia's eyes glistened as she brushed her lips against his. And you're ours, she whispered. Chris's heart swelled as Alicia leaned into his embrace. Beneath the golden light of the setting sun, Chris knew that this was the life he had always dreamed of. Not the wealth, not the business empire, but the quiet strength of love and the unshakable bond of family. Thank you for loving me, Chris whispered. Alicia smiled. Thank you for finding your way back to me, she replied. As their son's tiny hand curled around Alicia's finger, Chris knew in his heart that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Love had brought them back together, and faith had given them the strength to begin again. And as Chris held Alicia and their son close, he knew without a doubt that this was only the beginning of the beautiful life they would share together. True love thrives on patience, forgiveness, and unwavering faith. The greatest blessings often emerge after life's hardest trials. Instead of blaming your partner for difficult times, stand together with love and trust in God's perfect plan. Thank you for being part of this journey. Your support and love mean everything.